Welcome to Musicians versus the World. Well, we are starting our first episode of 2022 with a bang.
I have with me my guest, the beloved composer Christopher Norton.
Now, if you don't know, Christopher Norton is a massive voice in the world of music. He's composed concert works, stage musicals, ballet scores, orchestral music, jingles, and signature tunes for TV and radio, and is probably best known and loved for his educational piano and instrumental work. And he's known and loved by students and by music educators all over the world, and he has sold over 1 million copies over the past 30 years. And he's also a lecturer offering creative presentations both live and online, and has subjects such as improvisation, coaching. He's an adjudicator, composition, all sorts. Just he runs the gamut on wonderful things that he does to teach and inspire future musicians and music educators throughout the world. And he is here to enlighten and inspire us today. So, Christopher Norton, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to Musicians versus the World.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm just delighted to have you here. And a Happy New Year to you.
And to you.
How was your 21? Your
uh,
2021?
well, it's quite interesting because it's the second year of COVID, isn't it? So
Right.
everybody's kind of got used to the weirdly different rhythm of
Yeah.
not traveling for a start. Because my wife and I were traveling extensively all the time internationally, as far afield as New Zealand, lots in Europe, across to the States, and all that. And it's all stopped, and we love it. I mean,
Oh, you love it.
yeah. We've only travelled within Ontario and Canada, and even then, it's only in the last couple of months.
Yeah.
But we're both people who are used to working at home, and I've done lots and lots of things online as well, and
Right.
it's just been really nice to not have to constantly be filling up all that time with queuing at airports, and I don't really yet fancy doing an international trip with a mask on either. No, we've had a good year. I've got lots done, which I'll be telling you a little bit about, and she's got lots done as
Mhm.
well because she's also a composer. Yeah, and of course of a certain age. Uh, I'm not um, I'm not far away from the time when people would think, well, you could retire. So in a way, we're enjoying an early retirement while still working.
Well, speaking of working, you throughout your career, I would think it's safe to call you prolific. You have written and composed so many pieces. Um, does it ever get old, or do you just still love it?
I still love it because when I write, rather, it's from a rather mysterious place. I don't know. I think most people who write or paint or whatever, you don't know entirely where you get it from. So I sit
Hmm.
at the piano and suddenly I'm thinking of something, and I love that feeling of thinking I like this. I don't know where it's going yet, but we'll find out between us, between me and my uh, compositional self, if you like. I still really enjoy it. I'm actually doing writing and arranging every day, and it has the same buzz as it did when
Oh,
I was
really?
16. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I would like to talk about your childhood. So you started music very early. You started composing quite young. How did you
Um,
get
I,
into music?
well, I didn't really start as young as some people do. I was 14 when I started trying to write music for the first
Mm-hmm.
time. I'm from New Zealand originally, and there was no music in my family at all, not my immediate family anyway. But I was obviously very interested in music from a very early age because I was immediately listening intently if classical music played on the radio, that sort of thing. And my parents had some records, and I enjoyed all those. I remember two of the records my parents had, particularly, was Burl Ives and the Korean Orphans Choir sing Christmas carols, and
Oh, wow.
Tennessee Ernie Ford sings gospel. I mean, that was the kind of region because my father became a minister subsequently, so they were quite a religious household. And so
Right.
I heard hymns and songs of that sort, and I can play any hymn in any key. I learned
Mm.
to play by ear through church, if you like.
Hmm.
Um, but I was really keen on classical music. It's one of the funny things. Some children are just born with a instant identification with classical music, and I listened and played as much as I could find, and gradually, through having ownership of a tape recorder, started to record things off the radio, the concert program in New Zealand, and became aware that certain composers I really liked, and I was mad keen, particularly on Nielsen, for instance, Carl Nielsen, and
Wow.
actually sent away for the scores of all his symphonies when I was about 12 from the
Really?
publishers in Denmark. Yeah, I just was crazy about Nielsen and played his piano suite and Chaconne for piano and all that. I was
Wow.
also mad keen on Prokofiev and Rachmaninoff and Debussy and Ravel and of course all the classical composers as well. But because I discovered everything myself, in a way, I had a
Mhm.
slightly unconventional list of composers who I was really drawn to. I remember Prokofiev, Nielsen, Szymanowski, Martineau were four of my favorite composers when I was, between the ages of 12 and 14 or whatever. And I'd listened to all this stuff, read about them, and tried to find piano music by those composers. But at 14, I was on a summer holiday, and there was a piano there. It was my cousin's, and I suddenly thought I'd like to write something of my own. I'd never done it before, and it immediately had influences, if you like, from all
Right.
these things I'd listened to. And it's still like that in a way. I just have a lot of stuff I'm listening to. I still listen to music with great pleasure,
Mhm.
and it comes out in your compositions in a sort of a prism of your own particular voice, if you like. So
Yeah.
I think my early pieces still sound like me. I was there from the word go. And I think, in fact, we might even have an example of a very early piece
Mhm.
of mine, which you can hear the influences, not quite writ large, but they're certainly discernible as classical influences initially.
Right. Mhm. So you wrote your first piece, and then it looks like in New Zealand there was quite the musical life and musical atmosphere there. Could you
Well,
tell
there
me more
was
about that?
well, there were some strange things happened in those days, which might not happen now. And one of them was that if you wrote your own pieces and were a reasonably good player, you could go to the
Mhm.
local radio station. It would be broadcast on the National Concert Network. So I actually went down and recorded a number of my pieces at the local radio station when I was probably 16.
Wow.
And of course, they were quite good, and in fact, they got the attention of people in Wellington, which is where I ended up studying, or not studying, but living for a while. But some of New Zealand's best known composers were there, and one of them, in fact, lent me his house when I got to Wellington. So the fact that I did something which was noticed through doing a broadcast really launched me as a voice early on in New Zealand,
Mhm.
and then got a scholarship from the New Zealand government after doing my first degree in music, and went to Britain
Mhm.
to study composition. But there was another sort of confluence happen, and that is while I was at university, I got for the first time interested in pop music and rock and jazz because I hadn't ever really listened to any. I mean, not I wasn't against it. I just I was so immersed in classical music, I didn't really sort of have that on my radar. But a good friend of mine, who is still a good friend of mine, 40 years later, or would I say, 50 years later, was actually became one of New Zealand's best known rock critics, and he interviewed famous people like Bowie and the Stones and like when they came through. But he said to me, "Oh, you're not. You just need to listen to the right stuff." And so he was my kind of musical mentor. Gradually became aware of things I really really liked. And
Okay,
again, it
now
was the
who did he tell you?
well, it was the same as classical music, I think, in the sense that it wasn't necessarily a conventional list. I mean, one of
Right.
my favorite bands was Man, who are a Welsh band.
Okay.
Um, and I also I was immediately drawn to Genesis, whose name you will know,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and Yes, in other words, the sort of progressive
I
rock
have heard of
thing
them.
were the things that I particularly liked. But at the same time, jazz sort of entered the frame, and I actually went on a little course which was talking about jazz by a person who was the principal bassoon of the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, and he again was talking about harmonies and jazz chord progressions and all that, and I knew immediately that I was interested in this, and started to follow that up, and I joined a band for the first time in New Zealand. We had a keyboard or keyboards, and they said to me, I've never forgotten this. They gave me a whole lot of LPs and said, "We're doing this, this, and this," and named the tracks on the LPs, and then said, um, that's it. So they were assuming that I would listen to them and work out the keyboard parts from the recordings. And they said, "Oh, by the way, while you're at it, could you do chord charts for the rest of the band?"
Oh.
So I was thrown
Sure, why
in.
not?
So I was thrown in, but in fact, I discovered immediately that I really liked doing all that kind of transcription stuff.
Uh-huh.
So that became an interesting combination. In fact, my whole life's work, if you like, has been the collision between classical music background and popular music because I when I was in New Zealand, I was teaching high school music for 3 years, I think, while my wife was training to be a librarian. This is an exciting story, isn't it? Um, what I mean is, I needed a job, so I just got a
Right,
job teaching music in high school. And of course, they have no interest in classical music whatsoever.
right.
Kids of that age, they were all interested mostly in heavy metal and heavy rock. And so I started delving into what the students that I had liked, but I also started writing for them. And then I started trying, because I was a pianist, I won the New Zealand main concerto competition when I was 19, doing a Prokofiev concerto, funnily enough. So that I was at that sort of level. But I, meanwhile, was also playing in a band and playing for
Oh,
church.
how fun.
So it was a real funny combination. And I started writing pieces in which I had all the rigor of classical repertoire in terms of fingering, articulation, pedaling, and
Uh-huh.
so on. But it had the sound of popular music, and that's really my formula. I didn't mean to. I mean, I wasn't setting out to do it, but that's why this micro jazz series, which is my best known series, which first appeared in 1983, that's where it sprung from. It was that funny combination, and in fact, I've got a piano here. Would you able to? Can you hear that?
Oh, yes, I can hear
Yeah,
that. Fantastic.
because
Yep.
one of the earliest pieces. That was from Micro Jazz Collection 1, or 2 rather, called Oriental Flower. Now, that's not really a pop music piece, although it's got sort of jazzy overtones. It
Hmm.
could be deriving from the world of Satie or Debussy, if you like.
Right,
It's a kind of
exactly.
impressionist style. But meanwhile, the most popular piece in the same book, that's called Intercity Stomp. And in fact, I toured Australia a number of times in the later 80s, and Australian music stores used to have signs up saying "No Stairway to Heaven." But when this piece had been in the examination listing for quite a while, they actually signed up and
Right.
started saying "No Intercity Stomp."
Oh.
Because kids would come into the store and thump out these G's on the piano. They thought, we don't want to hear that again. So yeah.
Yes, yes, that I have taught
But what
that
I'm
piece
saying
in
is,
many
if you might
community
say those
settings.
two little fragments that I played you from the same book indicate the fact that I was working in multi directions. And that's,
Yes.
I think, part of my success is that people get the book and the pieces are good, but they're not by any means pastiche. They're actually a
Right.
composer's view on the styles, but they're also widely varied in their provenance, if you want me to call that word. Where I got them from is from all sorts of places. And therefore, I know that certain things. I love this sound, for instance, and I use that quite often. Well, that's the final chord of the Debussy cello sonata, you know. Or I like the sound of this,
Oh, yeah.
which is B flat 7 on my right hand and E major on my left hand, which is Martinu. In other words, he uses a lot of tritonal combinations of chords. And
Mhm.
again, even Intercity Stomp. The funny thing is that that fragment I played you of that
Mhm.
just beat it.
Yep.
The feel of it is beaten by Michael Jackson. So you can
It
see
sure is.
it's a weird kind of confluence of musical worlds, which happens to be me, and I've managed to express, if you like, the sort of range of things I like in how I write and what I write.
But that's why students love it. It mixes the things that they know to classical to instrument. I mean, it's perfect. It fits students just perfectly. It's really good. And it also, I think the level of detail that you put in your scores helps teachers that may not be accustomed to playing anything but classical, it helps them to know, okay, this is how it's supposed to sound. This is something I can take and use it pedagogically as well as something that the kids love to play.
Well, it's not just that. I think the articulation is incredibly specific. So if you play one of the pieces, I'm just trying to think. Oh yeah, it was called Nefertiti Blues,
Hmm.
and unbelievably specific. 3 note phrases, a staccato, a 2 note phrase, a grace note, and so you're learning how to play a style through following the instructions on the page, because there are enough
Hmm.
of them that you can't really go wrong. If you do exactly as written, you're doing it right. And one
Right.
of my favorite stories about my work actually came from Denver, from the late '80s. I toured America a number of times in the late '80s, and Microjazz 1 and 2 had just come out, and there was this big burly keyboard player came up to me, and he was a professional keyboard player. And he said to me, "Mr. Norton, I played through the first few pieces in your book, and I thought this guy writes like I play."
Oh, that's fantastic.
Isn't that a great story? Because
Yeah.
that's what I was always hoping, that in fact, if you're a keyboard player in a band and you sit down and play my stuff, you think, actually, this guy does write like I play, or writes like I should be playing, you know?
Oh my goodness. I can't think of a better compliment than that.
Yeah,
That some of my students sometimes when they get frustrated with classical, they say, "Oh, I want to do jazz because that must be so much easier." And I say,
yeah,
"Are you sure? Are you sure?
yeah.
I don't think you understand how complex and how detailed jazz can be." And I find that your series is a fantastic, launching point to see if they really do like it, because it has all of the detail that they know from classical, and it has so many of the same techniques, really.
But also, it's very pianistic as well. Quite a lot of
Yes.
jazz and pop music is arranged, but it's not really arranged that pianistically, or it can lurch between being quite hard and not very hard. What my pieces tend to do is be about the same level of difficulty throughout the piece. It's not suddenly a really awkward passage, if you like.
Right.
I think that's an important point. I'm not really consciously trying to do, but I've got a feel, an instinct that it's good to start with something and then not push it too far, one way or the
Hmm.
other, but trying to keep it at that level. And of course, most of my series, Connections is a good one. There's 10 volumes in Connections. In fact, there are 11
Hmm.
because it's a preparatory book. They're graded within the series, but each book is about the same level. So you can dip into the book anywhere, and they're all about the same
Right.
level of difficulty. Partly because when I wrote them, I didn't really try to grade them. Somebody else graded them for me. So a
Mm.
very good editor, and therefore he said to me, "You appear to have finished grade 3, but we're still shy of pieces for grade 7 or whatever." In other words, I had to fill some gaps in, but I didn't have to worry, which I thought was wonderful. I like the fact that it's a slightly subjective process, and that you
Hmm.
just write lots of pieces and then sort them out afterwards.
Hmm. That's really nice. That gives you more creative
Yeah.
freedom.
When I got to Britain in 1977, I was quite quickly picked up by a publisher called Universal Edition. Universal Edition published Schoenberg, and in particular they published Karl Orff.
Mm.
But they had an education manager, and I was introduced to them, and they asked me to do a couple of things. And one of them was a Christmas book, which was improvisations on Christmas carols, which is still very popular. And
Hmm.
in grade terms, it's about grade 8, so it's quite hard.
Hmm.
But
It's
the
beautiful.
education manager at Universal Edition said to me one day, he said, "Look, Chris, I've got a great idea for you. I'd like to write you to write me a series of graded pieces in popular styles." And I was at the Edinburgh Festival that year with a band doing a show, and I had some time, in the evenings or whatever, and I wrote something like 40 pieces in a block, which became Microjazz 1 and 2. But he then left the company and emigrated to
Oh.
Canada. He was at retirement age, and as it happens, nobody else in the company quite knew what I'd done or why I'd done it, and it just sat in my bottom drawer for 2 years. I mean, it was quite funny. But then I taught the piano at York University in Britain when I first arrived, to a number of undergraduates, and one of the undergraduates got a job at Boozy and Hawkes, who are a very famous publisher,
Mm.
and
Hmm.
her boss was the head of publishing, and he said to her, "Look, we've got a little arranging job that he's doing. Do you know any good young arrangers?" And she mentioned my name, and I did a job for them, and then I showed them the pieces for Universal Edition. And then he said, "What else have you done?" And I said, "I've got these graded pieces in Popular Styles." And I
In the
played,
bottom of my drawer.
yeah, and I played 2 or 3 of them to him, and he said to me, "This is going to be huge." And he named it Microjazz, and was responsible for the whole marketing plan and dashing new covers from a French artist which he commissioned. And they really put their weight behind it, and the rest is history. But the moral of the story is, if you've got something which is any good, it may sit in your bottom drawer because you need to find somebody who actually gets it.
Yeah.
Because in fact, there's a wonderful story about Microjazz, and that is somebody who worked for Universal Edition who's now passed away, so I can tell the story without fear of recrimination. Came up to the trade show in Britain about 1987. All my books are on the stand, and he knew that they'd kind of passed on the series. And he said to my friend, whose name was Rex, he said, "How's this going, this Christopher Norton series?" And Rex said, "Very well." And the other guy said, "Why do you think that is?" And Rex said, "Good marketing." And he pulled himself up to his full 6'2" and said, "Well, it must be, because it certainly isn't the music."
Oh my God.
And that's the thing. It's like the Beatles being turned down by many companies before EMI took them up. I mean, not that I'm saying I'm the same as the Beatles, but what I'm saying is you can have some good stuff, songwriters or whatever, but you still got to find someone who kind of understands your style and what you've done,
Right.
or you're up against a brick wall. And I certainly have read about many bands who've changed record labels, and suddenly, or the person who signed them is no longer there, and suddenly nobody's interested. So I was so lucky that I happened to find someone who got totally what I'd done. And in fact, he's still friends of mine. He's in his late 80s now. Rex, this guy, he's retired in France now, but he is still the same sparky individual that I met way back then. So anyway, there was a whole lot of luck elements. And then, of course, I did already have my second album written, in the sense that I already had pieces further than those, because at the moment they came out, they were picked up by the Associative Board, 2 of the pieces, which is amazing. Kids couldn't get enough of them, and so Bootsy and Hawks put out more in the series. And that's partly why I'm prolific. I think they just said we need 2 more books for a start, and then we need books of duets. Now we'd like to go into flute and piano, violin and piano. In other words, the series expanded to, well, I don't know how many, 150 books perhaps. It's a huge number of pieces, and they're not all the same pieces rearranged. I did different pieces for all the instruments as well.
Oh my goodness.
So
do you ever run out of ideas?
Well, no, because as I said, they all come from the same place. And when I'm talking about composition to students, I often say, they say I can't think of anything. I say, well, play me a note, and then I say, now you've started, because anything, you know what I mean? Anything is the starting point, if you like. So for me, anything is a starting point. Although many of the pieces, which have become particularly popular, I've started with a rhythm machine or a drum track. In other words, I do start with a sort of a particular groove, and that's immediately stimulating. I wrote the pieces in 1981. This is where this all sprung from, but I didn't really get them published until 1983. But I did write them in 1981. When I walked into this office and he said how good he thought they were, that was 1981. So they are 40 years old. So it's the 40th anniversary of Microjazz. And so Bootsy and Hawks decided, partly because of that, because it's strictly speaking, it's the 40th anniversary of when the pieces were written, to reissue my entire catalogue. But the other reason they're reissuing my entire catalogue with new covers and everything is that everything I did practically had backing tracks with it, really good backing tracks, and still regarded as among the best backing tracks on the market.
Yeah, they sound amazing.
But they're all on CDs. And so, of course, most people these days don't have CD players or don't use CDs. So they've reissued all of the catalogue with new covers, with links to, where they say basically available on all digital platforms, and they are. I've got a Spotify artist page. They're on Amazon. They're on Apple, and so on. So you can get the piano performances of the pieces, played by concert pianists, and many of them being played by very fine British concert pianists who I love the work of, called Ian Farrington. And then I got the backing tracks with the piano playing with it, and the backing track without the piano. And on some of them, we've got them slowed down as well. So, so what I'm saying is, you go to Spotify now, and you can see Christopher Norton. Just look up my name, and it immediately has huge numbers of books with all the backing tracks for them, and all the solo performances for the ones that are available so far. Um, so you can get the book, but then you've got access through streaming or through downloading to all the backings as well, without having to dig through a CD to find them. And
That's so
what's interesting
amazing.
about it is that I discovered very early on a very fine musician who I worked with for my whole life, who did the backings for me. He was just fantastic. He was a multi instrumentalist, and he totally got what I was doing. The rock preludes or Latin preludes they're very sophisticated backings, and he played real guitars on them, and he programmed bass and drums largely. But he also was a very good arranger of brass parts and all that sort of thing. And the data is still extremely good. It hasn't really dated in that sense. And one wild example of that, in fact, is that I had 3 publications out in 1994 to 7 called the Essential Guides. And they're
Mhm.
called the Essential Guide to Pop styles, to Latin styles, and to jazz styles. And it was like 30 pieces in each style, ranging from very early jazz to atonal jazz, in fact, in the jazz one. And the pop one was just a whole range of pop styles, including things like Journey, or things like Sting. I mean, all sorts. But just
Mhm.
little pieces for piano with fantastic backings. But they were never issued other than with MIDI backings. So that was an even
Mm.
more extreme example. You had the book, and people had these MIDI discs on the front, and thought, "What do I do with this?" So what's
Yeah.
happened? I've actually reissued. We're reissuing the books with new covers and with audio on all digital platforms, derived from the original MIDI, but using modern technology to make them sound even better.
Oh, wow.
But on top of that, are you familiar with SuperScore?
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
SuperScore, I put all 3 essential guides are on SuperScore, as well as all of Connections.
Oh my
So
goodness.
and lots of the micro jazz books as well. So I've got a lot of pieces on that very plastic medium. It's wonderful. It's on iPad. It's a free download on the iPad, and then you can
Mhm.
buy each album within the app. But that is interesting because the data you're hearing it's MIDI. So the MIDI
Mhm.
programming, as the guy who invented SuperScore said to me, the MIDI programming that I have is the best in the world. It's better than anybody else. It's this guy that I work with. He died 2 years ago, actually, younger than me.
Oh.
But he was just wonderful, and his legacy lives on big time.
Mm.
What I'm saying is, I don't just have a body of work in print, but I've got an incredible body of work in audio as well. And also, because of SuperScore, it's available in the MIDI medium, which
Mm.
means you can button out the left hand or the right hand. You can actually remix the backing track as well. You can play with just the drums. So it's a
Right.
fantastic medium for doing what I did, which is basically messing around yourself. Where you actually have just the drum track and you've learned the piece, and you think, I'll just have a little go at playing, writing my own piece. I've set that for students sometimes. I say, like, here's a track in a particular vein. Why don't you have a go at just doing your own thing on top of it and see what comes out? It's a good little exercise.
Yeah. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness, that's fantastic. Yeah, MIDI it's such a useful tool if you can use it properly. So that's
It's
incredible that
still
you
it's
have it.
still a very useful. It's still used a lot. I mean, film scoring is a lot of that's
Right.
done in MIDI still. There's no doubt about it because we're using triggering samples.
Right.
I'm using MIDI still every day. One thing I do, for instance, I've just recorded. Well, let me go back to your original question again. You mentioned what's the big news, and that is that we didn't just reissue the entire catalogue from Boozy and the Hawks with new covers and with the audio separated and put onto platforms. What happened as well was, during the pandemic, I had a chance to go through my archive, and it was really funny.
Mhm.
I had a folder of piano pieces, and I got them out, and they were really good, and they're all about grade 7, 8. They're quite advanced, and I couldn't even remember why I'd written them. Anyway, I showed them to Boozy and Hawkes, and they said, "We agree. These are great pieces," and they've put them out as microjazz collections 4 and 5. So we've got the first
Oh,
new microjazz piano books since the early '80s.
oh my
They've
goodness.
come out well, just at the end of 2021. They came out, and they're if you look at Spotify, for instance, microjazz collections 4 and 5 are there. But I've also done them all on YouTube. I've got a YouTube channel, and
Yes.
all of microjazz collections 4 and 5 are there on film. So I've actually recorded them all on video as well.
Well, that's so perfect. And
Yeah,
again, it just goes with how you are meeting the students where they are. And it seems like you've done this throughout your entire career, from the first time you wrote music for those high school students to now you're meeting them on the digital platforms, and that's where they are. And it helps them to connect with you as a composer, but also with your music and
yeah,
just music in general. And I wanted to read this quote for you. Boozy and Hawks, they just love you. There is a quote from James Eggleton. He's been recorded saying, "What makes Chris's material so unique is his ability to say something that really captivates the player and the audience in a very small space of time." I just love that.
yeah.
I
That is a
think
lovely
that's
quote, and he's a wonderful. He's my you might say my boss at Boozy and Hawkes. He's the head of publishing now, but he's a great guy. And I've just signed a new contract with Boots and Hawks, and my first
okay.
contract with them was back in the early '80s. So I'm still in the same relationship with the publisher after over 40 years, which is very unusual, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. That is incredible.
And what's amazing about Boozy and Hawks is they are putting everything on boozy.com that I've written,
Oh,
not
perfect.
just pieces that they publish. In other words, they're selling connections as well.
Oh, are they selling connections
Yes,
too?
yeah. So they actually are saying to me, "We'd like to have everything you've got." Because of course there's an unusual story connected to my own company. 80 Days Publishing is
Hmm.
another thing which I've sort of started up over the last little while. Um, one of the reasons that started up is I've had a number of projects which are slightly more um, specialist, you might say.
Okay.
Um, and I wanted to put the books out, but Boots and Hawks, being a sort of mass market publisher, if you like, they don't
Right.
tend to do things unless they think they're going to sell a couple of thousand copies at minimum.
Hmm.
I quite like the idea of being able to put out editions where you might sell 10, but you sell
Hmm.
10 every year, or you sell 10 in every territory. Not
Hmm.
that I'm aiming for small numbers, but I'm just saying some things are slightly more specialist. For instance, I had a
Right.
clarinet sonata, a bassoon sonata, a trio for
Hmm.
bassoon, clarinet, and piano, micro jazz for recorder ensemble. And so I was
That's
approached
awesome.
some years ago by someone who was a typesetter who had actually typeset even early micro jazz books. He's been typesetting for all the major publishers for years. He's based in Scotland now. And he said, "I'd like to sort of start this company up where we basically showcase your music." Um, and for the materials that come under microjazz and so on, Boozy and Hawks are still the publisher, so I pay them a royalty.
How does that work?
Well, we
Oh,
just do
because they
accordingly.
own the rights to it?
Yeah, and the rights to the pieces, yeah.
Oh, okay.
But they pay me a
Okay.
retainer and advance royalties and all that. So they're still looking
Oh, I
after me, if
see.
you like. But I pay them something back for the 80 days imprints. But something else
Okay.
happened, which is really an unusual story, and that is Connections was it was written for the Royal Conservatory in
Right.
2005. And the
Mhm.
person who ran the publishing division of the Royal Conservatory in Canada at the time said to me, "We'd like to do this series with you," which is a series. It's a series of graded pieces and popular styles. It was basically the same notion as microjazz, but across
Yeah.
8 levels. And he said to me, "The
Mm.
thing is, we're in Canada, and we also are trying to get into the States. Boozy and Hawks
Mhm.
aren't really doing anything much in North America. We would like to
Mm.
own the publishing rights to this series." Even though I was under contract to Boozy's, they said, "Ask them if they'll release this series." So they don't publish it, but it's published by us, because they said, "You're going to achieve so much good publicity through this series that it's worth
Uh-huh.
them having it out there, even if they don't own it." So, and at the time, I got them at the right moment. They agreed, right?
Oh, wow.
So that series was owned and published by the Royal Conservatory.
Right.
Wheel forward to 2018. I just arrived in Canada, having emigrated here from Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And I was approached by the Royal Conservatory. They said, for one reason or another, we're divesting ourselves of everything except our exam books. Would you like to
Mm.
buy the Connection series, publishing rights and all, and the name and the
Wow.
website? And I said, I certainly would. So I
Yes.
bought the entire series. So I own the Connection series, and that's become the main plank of 80 Days Publishing. Because what I've done then is I've expanded the series upwards and downwards to Connections 9 and 10, preparatory, duets. We're just about to
Mhm.
put out Connections for flute and
Oh, fun.
piano, for clarinet and
Hmm.
piano. But we've already got some out for violin and viola and piano. So I own the rights to those books. So it's a mixture of things owned by Boozy and Hawkes, which they're just sort of more specialists, which they wouldn't publish necessarily, but they own the rights to. And then I've also got this whole body of work which I do own. So it's an interesting combination. And anything connected to 80 Days, it's called 80dayspublishing.com, is available
Hmm.
anywhere in the world from the 80dayspublishing.com website, because we've done it in conjunction with an online publisher. So that if
Okay.
you're in Brazil or if you're in Australia, you can click on it and it takes you straight into your own currency, and it prints them with printing presses in your own country. So
Mm.
you don't have shipping costs. Like it's not being shipped from Canada or from Britain. It's shipped within your own country.
That's so
So it
smart.
brings the prices down quite a lot,
Yeah.
because that's a
Mhm.
problem. Uh, Um, I've had some stuff published by a Canadian publisher who are very good, but they said they always look slightly nervously if they get an order outside of Canada, because it's
Mm.
costing double the amount just to post one book for the price of the
Right.
book. So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
80 Days has gone down that route of having an online publishing house which has 120 presses around the world, and and so you don't have to worry wherever you are if you're listening to this broadcast. In fact, same with America. It's they're pressed within the states and shipped within the states. The other thing I should mention before we finish, by the way, you probably know this, but I've actually written 30 stage musicals as well.
Yes, the
Micro
micro musicals,
musicals.
right?
These were commissioned
Yes.
first by some schools in London, England, and they had a whole program running of them. In fact, two of the schools had a micro musical being done every term with every year group. Can you believe that?
Oh, fun.
But
Hmm.
they're again easy tunes to pick up. They're curriculum based. They're designed for kids up to the age of 11, broadly speaking, from 5 to 11. And my wife is a very good script writer and lyricist, so she's joined the team because my first wife died in 2013, and
Oh,
like
sorry.
Boozy and Hawks, I was with her for 41 years. So
Oh.
my first, but I remarried in 2014 to a Canadian who's a piano teacher who I'd known for years, who's a close friend already, but we were just friends, and she is a wonderful composer. Her name's Wendy Edwards Beardall Norton. It's rather a mouthful, but she's got her own
Mhm.
Spotify site and website as well.
Okay.
So it's rather nice having that sort of association. But it means at the moment I'm preparing for publication 24 more micro musicals through Boozy and Hawks, which are going to be coming out.
24.
Yeah, because we've got 6 out already, but they're doing another
Wow.
24, which are already written, but we just haven't put them out. And they're going to be available through Amazon. In other words, it'll be again print on
Oh,
demand
perfect.
kind of thing. But that's been an ongoing project as well, which is really fun.
So, yeah, so these musicals, they're curriculum based, so they have like a subject, like Romeo and Juliet, and
Romeo and
they're
Juliet is one
presented
of them.
for
Yeah,
young
there's
children.
one called The Vikings. There's one about the Great
Uh-huh.
Fire of London. There's one about the
Uh,
American Revolution. So
oh,
yeah. So and the kid. I teach the entire musical in one sitting. I have a group of like 88-year-olds, and I teach them all the songs of a musical in one sitting, and they've got them because they're that the tunes are that easy to pick up. But they do cover a very wide. They cover a very wide range of styles as well. I mean, you'd be
yeah.
surprised.
That well, congratulations on all of this happening. Last question.
Yeah.
I know there will be young musicians listening to this and just listening about your life and wanting to be you, pretty much. So, what advice would you give to young musicians or young composers as they embark on their composing careers?
I think one of the things that I discovered, I was studying music at university level, and I was
Mhm.
writing short tonal piano pieces in the middle of a milieu where everybody's expected to write hard-nosed serial music or whatever. I just
Mhm.
didn't do that. I didn't. I mean, I could, but I decided I'm just going to do what I like the sound of. In other words, I followed my
Mhm.
own voice, and that's why I've been successful. And I think everybody's got a distinctive voice already. So there's that. Believe in your own voice. But secondly, like I'm doing quite a lot of publishing of other people at the moment, and I've got some lovely pieces from a piano player, an American piano player, which I think are really good. They're all black note duets, so it's for kids to play
Okay.
just black notes. But there's no editing. In other words, there's no phrasing, articulation, pedaling, or fingering. And so I'm saying the next thing to do is try and make sure that you notate exactly how it should be
Mhm.
phrased and articulated and all that. Get the notation looking really good. Um, and the other thing is, of course, is to explore the notion of what the accompaniment might be. In other words, play around a little bit with backings, if it's in a popular style, of course. Um, the other thing is a lot of composition students I've got. This is adults as well as students. They come up with an idea and then they go straight on to another idea and then another and another. Never come back to the first one. And I'm thinking,
Mhm.
well, all the models from Beethoven to Brahms, being a good example or whatever, they have an idea and it's very clear. They repeat the idea, perhaps with some
Mhm.
variations. Then they do another. Then they come back to the first one again. There's too much composition done, which is pure rhapsody, where they've obviously forgotten what the first idea was. They're just improvising freely, and therefore the listener get kind of loses the thread.
Right.
So I'm saying try to be logical in your in your compositions as well. Quite a few people would like to do film music, but a lot of the time that's very logical. In other words, or uses motivic ideas. In other words, if you've got an idea, believe in it enough to actually repeat it for a start. One lovely little jazz anecdote, actually, it's about improvising, but it applies to composition as well, which I love. Somebody said once that too much repetition, the audience gets bored. Too much variety, they get alienated.
Oh,
so,
that's good.
so I think you need to sort of strike that balance between repetition and variation, if you like, when you're doing composition. The other thing is, as I discovered, if you write stuff and you think it's good, it could be in your bottom drawer. You need to find the right person or people
Mhm.
who understand what you've done. And so don't assume just because you get turned down that it's because it's no good. It may be because you haven't struck the right person who kind of gets what you've done.
Yeah. Yeah, that's excellent.
And the other thing is
Excellent advice.
write stuff beyond what you've written now, because if you do have any opportunities, it's like bands with their second albums. You don't want to suddenly think, oh, I've written all the stuff I can write. I don't know what else to write.
Mhm.
Have stuff in your bottom drawer ready to go.
I love
I've still
that.
got stuff in my bottom drawer ready to go from way back, which and sometimes I don't think that much of it, but then I bring it out and think, actually, no, I can see why I liked it at the time, but it could
Yeah,
be 40 years later. It's never too
right?
late.
Never too late. I love it. Well, that's fantastic advice. Christopher Norton, I so appreciate your time. Thank you so much for meeting with me today and speaking about your wonderful career, your fantastic music. I just wish you all the best in 2022, and I'm going to be looking forward to seeing what comes next
Thank you very
from that
much.
amazing mind of yours. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been a great pleasure.